So in a follow-up to my other video, this time I want to talk about the times when you can buy your way out of trouble, when good gear, or perhaps more accurately, the right gear, is the answer to your problems. So as a working professional photographer, kit is really, really important to me. It's how I make my money in a sense. And as such, what I choose to buy, I consider very, very carefully. I have, as I perhaps hinted in the previous video, made some big mistakes in the past. I have definitely put money into things that were not worth putting money into. As a professional though, I consider very, very carefully what's called return on investment. Namely that if I put money into something, it's an investment. It's not just buying it because it's shiny and I like the look of it. It needs to make me money. And what that generally means is that I'm either buying kit that basically enables me to do my job, so sort of the nuts and bolts and the essential tools of my business. Sometimes I'm buying those because the existing ones have simply worn out, because I do tend to wear my cameras into the ground. Or I'm buying something that genuinely offers me something I've not been able to do previously and might give me some kind of competitive advantage or offer something to my clients that they perhaps can't get elsewhere. Those are generally the two reasons why I invest. So I'll buy kit because I need it to perform my basic duties as a professional photographer, or if it offers me something that little bit more, that bit more advanced, that bit special. But actually the latter case is fairly rare. The other thing that is quite a professional consideration that perhaps amateurs don't often appreciate is that gear decisions are overwhelmingly up to me. I can't think of an instance in my nearly 30-year career where a client has ever booked me for a job and requested specific equipment. That's just not how things work. They will have specific requirements in their brief, hopefully their nice, clear, easy to understand brief, and then it's up to me to fulfill that brief. And I then make the equipment choices, whether it's equipment I own and choose to invest my money in, or whether it's equipment I rent, in order to actually create the images thereafter. So what I choose is down to me, and I have to make that choice based on the sort of work I'm producing and the sort of work I think I'll be producing in the future. So the choice of equipment really, really is quite critical. It's not something I take lightly, despite often saying I'm not a photographer who cares very much about gear. So how can equipment help? How can you buy your way out of trouble? Now, sadly, this isn't the point where I tell you exactly which camera, lens, tripod is the best thing out there. Sorry, it's not one of those videos. What I can offer you instead is some general principles that have served me well over, like I say, nearly 30 years, that you should apply when you come to think about where to spend your hard-earned cash on equipment. Now, I mentioned earlier that one of the reasons to invest in equipment is if I believe it can offer me a competitive advantage over my peers, allow me to offer something to the client that they can't get elsewhere. Now, the truth is, actually, this happens very rarely. Usually, equipment improvements, changes are much, much more incremental. It's very rare for there to be a revolution in equipment. However, they do happen. Thinking back personally, a really good example for me was back in nearly 20 years ago, 2002, 2003. I'd already been shooting digital a little bit, but I thought, right, clearly got to go in all this. Bought a DSLR, not the very top of the range ones, but still quite a big investment, and almost immediately saw an upturn in the amount of work I was getting because I was able to offer, at that stage, what was higher quality digital imagery, quicker and better than some of my peers were doing. And not long after that, in about 2004, I got quite a big fat loan out and bought a laptop. Now, a laptop nowadays would seem to be, well, what's the big deal? But 18 or so years ago, laptops were A, still quite expensive, and B, still not that common. And the ability as a professional photographer to download the images there and then on a job, show the client, and even process and deliver them immediately if needs be, was a real game changer. Now, of course, lots and lots and lots of people then caught up, and I wasn't the first to do this, don't get me wrong. I'm not claiming to have invented shooting on location with a laptop, anything silly like that. But it was quite a big decision to make in terms of investment. Like I say, I got a loan out, which to me is very alien. I don't normally do that sort of thing. And I saw a definite upturn in revenue and definitely a big return on investment. Like I say though, instances like that where equipment comes along and genuinely changes the game, they're actually quite rare. What's more common is you're looking for incremental improvement and lots of little ways that you can make your life as a photographer easier and allow you to reduce the barriers between you and taking great images, stuff that smooths the path as much as possible. So here are some principles to think about when all that cash is burning a hole in your wallet and you're desperate to spend money on equipment. Some of these aren't necessarily buy this and it will make your life better. In some cases if you do the opposite, your life will definitely be more complicated. So one of the first things to consider when you're about to blow some money on equipment is that slightly abstract term, build quality. Generally, you get what you pay for and you want the best you can get. As a working professional, I rely on my cameras and I want them to keep working, and I'm prepared to pay extra to get that reassurance that they'll last a long time and they can handle the very wide range of situations I tend to throw at them. Now, ascertaining build quality can be a bit challenging because other than perhaps mentioning it in an online spec where they say, it's got some weatherproofing or, made to high standards, the only way you can really tell if something is made with good quality is to handle it yourself or have somebody you trust handle it, or if there are reviews online that you definitely trust, to believe what they say. It's a bit abstract until you yourself can handle these things, but believe me, the old adage about buying cheap, buying twice is definitely true. And of course this goes for things beyond just cameras. Yes, you will pay more for a higher build quality pro spec camera, even though this specification may not seem that much better than, say, the prosumer or advanced amateur camera. A lot of the money will have gone into the weatherproofing, sealing, all those sort of things. But things like tripods, light stands, that's where build quality can really matter. I personally, I don't know how many I broke, a good 3 or 4 cheap tripods way back in the day before I finally bit the bullet and bought a proper Manfrotto tripod, really high spec, and I'm still using it 25 years later. Okay, the truth is, it really is the case that, buy cheap, buy twice. Now actually, whilst I mentioned tripods, another way that you can buy yourself out of trouble, if you like, and it's a worthwhile investment of your money to get good equipment, is with camera and light support. Cheap tripods, cheap lighting stands will cost you money because things will fall off them, and that gets very expensive. I've been there. Trust me, it's painful, it's expensive, and if it happens on a job with lots of people around, it's also potentially quite dangerous. Another quality to look for in equipment is speed. Now, I'm not just talking about a camera with a fast frame rate or how fast it focuses, although those things are very useful. I'm talking about things like read-write speeds, transfer speeds. I'm talking about flash recycling times. All those almost esoteric things that you perhaps don't think about. You think you can stick any old memory card in a camera and you'll be fine, or any old flash will do, until time is of the essence and suddenly the little light not going out in the back of the camera because it's still writing all the files, or your flash taking 5, 6, 7 seconds to recycle rather than a second and a half, that becomes a big deal, okay? And that sort of thing you can find out from the spec. And again, it's one of those cases where, the more you spend, generally the faster you'll get. Another example, which I suppose really comes down to speed, but is also almost the perfect case of spending your money wisely and buying your way out of trouble, is with computers. Whether it's a laptop or a desktop, it's well worth taking the time not only to investigate different components and how fast they run whatever software you're going to use, but also, perhaps biting the bullet and spending more than you might originally have planned. Because this is one of those areas where, certainly as a professional, time is money, but even as a keen amateur, the amount of time you will lose if you're working with slower, older computers or lower spec computers, it's quite hard to quantify, and it can be a huge time sink. To put it very simply, if a 500 quid cheap as chips laptop takes 15 seconds to process one of your raw files out to JPEG to whatever it might be, and a higher spec desktop with custom components and things takes 5 seconds to process exactly the same image, well, that's a massive difference. If you're only doing a handful of files, you probably won't really notice. If, like me, you're working with hundreds of files at a time, or you're editing 4K video, suddenly that's a huge difference. And it is the case that spending more money and carefully choosing components, faster hard drives, more processors, more RAM, more graphics card. All of these things can offer you a speed advantage, and that's time that you get back. That's time you get to spend on other things rather than watching progress bars march their way tediously across the screen. So the last factor to consider if you're about to throw a lot of money at equipment is what I would broadly call functionality. How usable and how well thought out the equipment or the system is. The best way I can describe this is, if you'll indulge me for a moment, to disappear down the rabbit hole of my long history with location flash. Now, I've used flashes on location arguably for nearly 30 years, if you go right back to my days on the local paper, with a great big Hammerhead METS 45, and I've used lots and lots of different systems in that time. By the late 2000s, I was doing lots of location flash lighting for lots of my magazine work, and getting those flashes to work outside on location was often a bit of a sort of Heath Robinson-esque way of working. You would have a monoblock, and then to make it work outside you'd have to attach a separate battery, and then to trigger it from a distance you'd need to attach a radio trigger to it. Sometimes I even used what's called an AC inverter, whereby you had to earth the pack as well, so you'd have to clamp it to a radiator or stick a stake in the ground to stop it misfiring. All of these things meant that, I could take these big powerful lights on location and get beautiful location light, but they were a pig to use. There were so many extra links in the chain. By the early 2010s, I had, I think, 2 or 3 different systems on the go, in fact, which is not a great way to work. It was a pain in the backside. And in fact, what I was doing was just putting, good money after bad. I was further investing in stuff that wasn't really helping. Finally, in about 2015, I bit the bullet and invested in ProPhoto Kit. Now, I'm not here to sell you ProPhoto, because now not only are there lots and lots of alternatives around, it's more that at the time they were offering the best kind of all-in-one solutions possible. Because what happened was I went from, as I say, something like a monoblock with a separate battery and a separate radio trigger to something like, this is now a B10, but back in the day I bought B1s, something that is totally self-contained. So the battery is attached to the unit, the radio trigger receiver is inside the unit. I can plonk this on a stand and kind of walk away. It needs so little attention, and that is a quality that's quite hard to define. It means that I can put these things up, and as I've stressed in both these videos, it means that my gear isn't getting in my way. It means that my gear is not an obstacle to me taking photographs, it smooths the path. And if I can summarise both these videos, then that would be the thing to take away, okay? Yes, gear can buy you an easy life, but all too often you're actually going to disappear down a rabbit hole and throw, good money after bad. Always remember that firstly, none of this gear is of any use whatsoever unless you know how to use it. But more importantly, you've got to bear in mind this stuff has to make your life easier and offer you things you couldn't do before and allow you to take greater images. If in any way it slows up that process, if it prevents you from taking greater images, you end up spending more time worrying about maintaining, transporting, setting up, fiddling with your kit, then you're doing the wrong thing.